Ever felt like a stranger at your own kitchen table?
Family celebrations in my household always look the same. Too much food covering every available surface, too many relatives talking over one another as if volume could win them respect, and just enough alcohol flowing to make everyone loosen their tongues, but not enough to dull their sharpness. I had grown up in that atmosphere of clinking glasses and forced laughter, a place where everything seemed cheerful on the outside, but carried the weight of comparison and subtle digs beneath the surface. On that particular evening, we were gathered around the long oak dining table that had hosted decades of birthdays, graduations, and holidays, the kind of table that had absorbed arguments, reconciliations, and gossip into its very grain. My father, a man who prided himself on tradition, had made sure everyone was seated in their designated places, because in his world order mattered even when love didn't. I sat between my husband, Eric, and my cousin, listening to a half-hearted story about some business deal that had supposedly gone spectacularly right for my older brother. The room smelled of roast beef, garlic bread, and that faint undercurrent of expensive wine my father always insisted on serving as proof that we were a classy family. Plates were clattering, forks tapping, voices rising and falling, when suddenly, in a lull that felt almost scripted, my father stood up with his glass raised high. His voice carried with the kind of authority he had always demanded, and without hesitation, he declared, "To my favorite child, the real achiever." The words sliced through the chatter like a blade. The family burst into laughter, that nervous kind that often covers discomfort, and all eyes instinctively turned toward my brother, Michael, who wore the smug expression of someone used to being crowned without question. People chuckled, some even clapped, as if my father's toast were nothing more than a joke everyone had heard before and accepted as truth. I laughed too, but only because it was easier than showing what I felt. Inside, though, it was like something cracked, a familiar wound reopening. That single line from my father was a distillation of years of being treated as the background character in my own family, the one who cleaned up after everyone, who lent money that was never repaid, who kept her mouth shut to keep the peace. Michael had always been the golden boy, the achiever who somehow needed constant bailing out yet still managed to shine in their eyes. My chest tightened, my hands grew clammy, and my fork froze midair. I could feel Eric beside me shift slightly, his silence louder than the laughter echoing around us. Eric was not the kind of man who tolerated pretense for long, and over the years, he had grown weary of watching me play the part of the dutiful daughter, smiling through insults disguised as jokes. I turned my head just enough to catch the look on his face, that mixture of disbelief and rising anger, his jaw tight, his hand gripping his glass so firmly his knuckles whitened. The air around him felt charged, as though he were seconds away from breaking a rule no one dared to break in this family, the rule of silence, the rule of swallowing your pride. He leaned forward, setting his glass down with deliberate calm, and in a voice that carried effortlessly across the table, he said, "Really? Because these bank statements show who's been carrying you." The room froze. I swear even the air stopped moving. Forks hovered above plates, spoons clinked against bowls mid-motion and then stilled. The laughter died instantly, replaced by stunned silence that seemed to echo louder than the noise had. My brother's smirk faltered, my father's hand stiffened around his wine glass, and my mother blinked as if she had just seen a stranger walk into her living room uninvited. No one knew whether to speak or wait, and so we all just sat there, caught in that suspended moment where truth had cracked the surface of carefully maintained illusions. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I realized every pair of eyes had shifted toward Eric, then toward me, waiting to see what would happen next, waiting to see if I would deny it, laugh it off, or finally let the truth breathe. And in that moment, I knew nothing in this family would ever look the same again. Silence at our table never lasted long because my family treats quiet like an accusation. Yet for a stretched and breathless minute you could hear the clock over the stove thudding in slow motion and the soft mechanical hum of the old refrigerator that my mother refuses to replace because, in her world, things that look fine from the front must be fine inside as well, which is convenient logic when the item in question is a machine and less convenient when it is a human being who has been propping up the performance for years. My father remained standing with his glass lifted, his jaw angled the way it always is when he wants to look like the man who built the house with his own hands, even though he hired out every job and then took a bow at the end. Michael shifted in his chair with that loose, entitled posture I recognized from grade school trophy photos, and my mother gave me the pleading look of a woman who knows a fire has started and still whispers that everyone should please pretend it is candlelight. I could feel eyes on me in a slow, radiating circle, cousins and in-laws and neighbors who wandered in for cake, but stayed because family drama beats dessert every time, and beneath the pressure of their attention I felt something steady rise in me. Not rage exactly. More like the sturdiness you get when you are finally done apologizing for carrying a load no one else admits exists. Eric did not move, and the stillness of that man always tells me more than his words, which is saying something tonight, because he had just lobbed a truth grenade into a room trained to applaud illusions, yet his voice, when he finally spoke again, came out measured and calm. The way you explain a complicated return policy to a smug store manager who thinks you will give up and go home. He clarified that there was no need for anyone to panic. No one was being attacked, and if my father's toast had been a harmless joke, we could all file it under poor taste and move on. But since the joke had a history and a budget and an unspoken rule that I would never bring up what Michael cost us year after year, he thought it might be better if the story of the evening matched the reality that funded it. My brother laughed, too loudly, insisting that we were being dramatic and that families help each other, which would have been a lovely sentiment if he had ever been part of the helping team. He added that his startup needed runway and that I had always believed in him, which I had, although belief is not the same as moving money at 2 a.m. so a car payment does not bounce and a lender does not call my mother at work. I could sense the room recalculating, everyone rushing to pick a safe island to stand on while the tide shifted, and, because I know these people better than I know most of my friends, I spoke in a way they would understand, plain and steady. The way PTA treasurers and neighborhood organizers talk when the budget is short and someone needs to stop pretending the cookies paid for themselves. I said that I loved my family, genuinely, that I had no interest in a public takedown beyond the takedown my father initiated with his toast, and that I had done what I did for the same reason women like me do most things. Because when the house leaks and the dog needs the vet and the sibling calls again and the bank holds the payment, someone in this family solves it, someone cuts from her own plans, and for a very long time that someone had been me. My mother whispered my name, a warning wrapped in affection, but I could feel a strange relief settling over my chest, the kind of relief that arrives when the lie that tired you out finally lies still. Michael leaned forward, cheeks bright, and declared that he never asked to be worshipped, which is technically true, since my father handed him worship on a silver platter, and he added, with a smirk, that any transfers we ever made were investments and that our turn would come, which was funny considering how many turns we had already taken and how little return had bothered to visit us afterward. My father told Eric to put the phone away and stop embarrassing the family, and he said it in that commanding register he uses on waiters and contractors and sometimes me, as if tone alone could close a topic. But the thing about a bill is that you can ignore the envelope only so long before the lights go dark. I took my own phone, slid open the family group thread that has mainly served as a repository for awkward birthday photos and casserole recipes, and I uploaded one tidy document Eric and I had spent an evening assembling after the last time Michael's emergency outran his promise. Not every transaction, not even most of them, just a clear snapshot of highlights with dates, descriptions, and notes that translated bank language into plain English, and a short cover message that I typed with the even, cheerful rhythm of a PTA announcement. Since we are celebrating achievement, I wrote, it might help to see the backstage crew credits, so our applause can be honest. I hit send, felt the table's hush thicken, and then heard the chorus of small pings around the room as phones vibrated in pockets and purses like tiny, unavoidable bells. My cousin opened her screen and inhaled sharply. My aunt pressed her lips together in a way that has always meant she is protecting someone who does not deserve it, and my father's color changed half a shade toward the kitchen wall. Michael tried to chuckle, but it snagged in his throat when he saw the line items neatly labeled, and he turned to me with a wounded expression, calling it petty, calling it vindictive, and asking how I could humiliate him in front of the family. As if I had dragged him here in chains and forced my father to pronounce him a champion. I smiled without showing teeth and told him that humiliation is a dress we all own. Some of us just keep it folded in the back of the closet until someone else decides we should wear it to dinner. For my first piece of revenge, small and pointed the way a tack on a chair is small and pointed, I followed that document with a second message in the same thread, a light-hearted poll titled Family Scholarship Fund, name suggestions with options including Favorite Child Endowment, Emergency Achievement Initiative, and Backstage Crew Trust, a joke with a sting that registered in every blink around the table, because laughter is how we survive shame here and also how we measure it. The votes began to stack in little bubbles, a few relatives choosing humor to avoid choosing sides, and for a minute the tension uncoiled just enough for people to breathe again. Then my father, very quietly, set his glass down and told Eric and me to step into the den if we had more to say, because whatever this was would not continue at his table, not tonight, not ever, and he said it in a tone I had not heard since childhood. The tone that means lines are being drawn on floors and hearts. I stood, smoothed my napkin, and followed him, aware of every stare at my back and the soft tapping of messages flying across the thread, and just before I crossed the threshold into the den I felt my phone buzz with a new notification from an unknown number. A subject line that carried my maiden name and a word I had not expected to see in this story at all: collateral. The den in my parents' house has always felt like the place where adults pretend to be reasonable, a room with heavy curtains and framed diplomas that tell a story about discipline while the real decisions get made in whispers over the sink. And as my father closed the door behind us with that deliberate, stagey quiet that warns everyone to lower their voice and raise their guard, I glanced at the unknown message on my phone because the subject line had my maiden name next to the word collateral, which is not a word you ever want to see paired with your identity unless you knowingly sign something, which I had not. The text was bare and businesslike from a number I did not recognize, a photo of a pledge agreement bearing a clean, practiced signature that could easily fool anyone who did not live in my hand, and a short note asking me to confirm that I remain the personal guarantor for my brother's revolving line of credit, which had fallen past due by just enough to trigger a call list. Eric saw my face change and took the phone without asking, then angled it so my father had no choice but to look, and the moment his eyes flicked toward the signature, and then away in that 1-second flinch that betrays more than any speech, a whole timeline arranged itself in my head with the steadiness of a spreadsheet totaling up a column you did not know was there. My mother sank onto the arm of the leather chair and reached for the paperwork as if a softer grip could make the lines blur, asking some version of the question every woman in her position asks when the ugly thing on the table might yet be a misunderstanding. And she asked whether there was any chance I had forgotten signing during a busy month or a holiday crisis, the kind of generous amnesia mothers deploy when hope is still cheaper than truth. I told her calmly that even on days I let the dog out twice and still forgot the second time, I would remember attaching my name to a bank product, and I would remember it because my signature is the one thing I still own outright in this family. My father started in on a lecture about opportunities and bridge financing and how the world is hard on young entrepreneurs, and he used the tone he reserves for sermons about grit. Yet the syllables skidded whenever they approached the part where my name became an instrument, and when Eric asked who signed for me, my father did not say the word I, he said the word we, which is a subtle thing only if you have not been translating him for decades. Eric, who has the patience to assemble a bicycle on Christmas Eve without swearing and the impatience to hang up on a customer service line after the second hold music loop, put the phone on speaker and returned the banker's message with the same steady tone he used at the table, announcing that we were all present and that I was hearing this for the first time tonight. Then he asked for the loan number and the date the guarantee was executed, and as the banker read off a month from 2 summers, A go and a branch across town where Michael prefers to be known as a rising founder rather than an overdrawn customer. My father closed his eyes in a slow blink that looked almost like prayer. I felt the part of me that still asks for permission begin to melt, the way permafrost gives up secrets when the heat finally does its work, and I told the banker, clearly and without ornament, that the signature was not mine. That I would be filing an identity theft report before the night was over, and that until the matter was resolved the bank should treat any personal guarantees under my name as disputed obligations. The banker, who had started the call with stiff politeness, softened into the careful sympathy professionals learn when the map suddenly shows cliffs, and he explained the steps, the affidavits, the holds, the potential freeze on the line itself while the guarantee was reviewed. Which meant Michael's runway would stop feeling like a runway and start feeling like a gravel road. My father said this could be handled privately if we would just stop dramatizing, that families absorb mistakes and move on, and he looked at my mother for the nod that has saved him from too many consequences. But even she could not pretend to swallow a signature with my name on it, and she whispered the kind of plea that sounds like housekeeping, let's not involve outsiders, when what she meant was please do not detonate our story in front of our neighbors. I laughed, not because any of it was funny, but because my family has always underestimated the uses of daylight, and I opened the family thread we had just christened with my ledger. Then attached the photo of the guarantee beneath a single sentence that tried to be gentler than I felt. Here is tonight's encore. Phones hummed in the dining room, a chorus of polite vibrations that made my father flinch again, and my aunt, bless her diplomatic heart, sent a single bubble that read, in the kind of brittle neutrality that slices like a paper cut, this seems complicated. Michael barreled in without knocking, face bright red, talking over everyone in a rush of justifications that included favored myths about term sheets and inevitable success if small-minded people would stop nitpicking, and he accused me of overreacting, of sabotaging him out of jealousy, of not understanding that big moves require bold signatures, which would have been almost poetic if he had not just claimed ownership of my name. I told him evenly that big moves also require consent, and that my second piece of revenge tonight would be unglamorous, but effective. I opened the credit bureau app one had downloaded after the last emergency, initiated a freeze across all 3 bureaus, filed the affidavit the banker mentioned using the template that practically walked me through the language, and because shame works best when it comes wrapped in logic, announced in the thread that any new debt using any variation of my name would trip alarms before morning, which is the domestic equivalent of switching on a floodlight in a backyard raccoon convention. He called me cruel, my father called me ungrateful, my mother called me by my childhood nickname as if syllables could rewind the tape, and Eric stood beside me like a steady piece of furniture you never notice until you need to lean on it. And into that rising clamor I dropped one more tidy action with a smile I did not bother to hide. I forwarded the banker our family thread archive from tonight, the toast, the ledger, the guarantee picture, so the bank's compliance unit would not need to guess at context. Then I set the phone down and asked, as mildly as I could manage, which of them would like to explain how my maiden name ended up on a branch manager's dotted line, because the next explanation would not be delivered to me but to a notary. On the other side of the closed den door the dining room buzzed like a hive, and right as my father opened his mouth to deliver whatever version of history he had rehearsed for this eventuality, the doorbell rang with that old, officious chime my parents never replaced, a sound that has introduced neighbors, packages, and bad news in equal measure, and the silence that followed it was so complete even the refrigerator seemed to hold its breath while my mother stood, smoothing her dress with shaking hands, and said in the softest voice I have ever heard from her, "Do not open that door unless you are ready to live with what is on the other side." The hallway from the den to the front door felt longer than it has ever been, a glossy runner stretching over wood that my father polishes every other Sunday until it shines like a showroom floor. And with each step I could feel the weight of the house's rituals pressing in, the framed school photos arranged like a family resume, the vacation seashells glued to a shadow box that pretends messy trips were elegant, the stiff portrait of my grandparents staring down with that stern, mid-century Patience that mistakes silence for virtue, and I thought, as my mother's hand hovered over the knob, that families like ours are museums with excellent lighting and very limited access to the archives. When she opened the door, the night air came in first, cool and almost medicinal after the heat of the dining room. And then the courier stepped forward with the kind of polite boredom of a man who has delivered more uncomfortable envelopes than he will ever admit, asking for Michael by his full name, and holding out a packet sealed with that brown clasp that makes your stomach duck even before you read the return address. Michael shouldered past me, grabbed the packet with the bravado of someone who still believes paperwork is a temporary annoyance rather than a language with rules, and he tore it open right there on the porch, scanning lines in a hurry that collapsed when the words took shape, because lawsuits do not shout, they hum, a firm, low tone that announces its own patience. Inside the den again, with the door closed and the party stranded in a rumble on the other side of the wall, my father demanded to know who sent it, as if sender mattered more than sentence, and Michael said the name like a cough. A vendor from 3 months ago who had offered generous terms in exchange for a personal guarantee, a guarantee that apparently grew arms and legs and learned to climb into other agreements whenever my brother needed a taller ladder, which meant tonight's bank surprise was not a solo performance, but part of a traveling show that had been playing our town for longer than I knew. I could feel the exact shape of the humiliation waiting for me if we continued quietly, the careful family memo in 2 days calling this a misunderstanding, the holiday invitation in 2 months asking us to forget and move on. So before anyone suggested a truce, I carved a new path with the smoothest voice I own, the one I use when I am asking a school administrator to reconsider a policy without making him defensive, and I said that since we were already in the business of reality checks, we should extend tonight's honesty to the wider audience that has always paid for the tickets without seeing the backstage. My third piece of revenge was unshowy and almost tender in its precision. A nudge disguised as grace. I opened the alumni group page where my father loves to post photos of Michael's entrepreneur panels and fundraiser handshakes, and I wrote a careful note about the virtue of accurate narratives, thanking the community for supporting our family through thick and thin while clarifying, without adjectives, that big achievements are sometimes buoyed by quiet contributors whose names stay off the plaque, and to illustrate the point I linked a short, anonymized explainer titled, How Not to Burn Your Guarantors, a friendly primer on consent and credit with example signatures redacted, but the dates unmistakably recent. It read like a public service announcement, because that is what it was, and before my father could lunge for the phone I hit post and watched the small flood of polite comments roll in, each carrying the civic tone of people who realize they have clapped for a story built on someone else's time and money and are not sure whether to be embarrassed or angry. Michael sputtered that I was ruining him, which would have been more persuasive if the envelope on the coffee table had not already beaten me to the job, and my mother asked me, very quietly, whether I was sure I wanted to light a match in our living room, because smoke stains take years to scrub out even when everyone stops pretending the fire never happened. I wanted to tell her that sometimes a controlled burn is the only way to keep the whole field from going up in August, but I spared her the metaphor and reached for something plainer. I told her I was done funding an image in installments while being priced out of my own life, and that I had one final step tonight, not to ruin anyone but to stop being ruined by them. From my bag I pulled a slim manila folder, the unromantic texture of self-respect, containing a notarized letter I drafted last week after the last emergency skirted disaster, a letter rescinding any informal family understanding that I would help as needed, a phrase that sounds sweet until it eats your spine, and in the same motion I slid across the low table a short, written agreement for my parents that proposed an exchange. I would suspend the identity theft report for 72 hours and consider a mediated settlement if, and only if, my father issued a written correction to the alumni page retracting the favorite child framing. Michael acknowledged the guarantees in a statement sent to creditors and the house fund they manage, an account I have contributed to for years under a name I never liked. Returned my documented surplus in installments with interest that matched the family's preferred savings rate. all drafted by a neutral attorney and signed in front of a notary, so no one could later pretend the conversation had been a misunderstanding after wine. Eric watched me the way you watch a tightrope walker you love. My father stared at the folder as if paper could be rude, and Michael laughed too loudly and called the terms ridiculous until his eyes snagged on the final clause. A simple sentence stating that if the agreement was not signed by Monday, I would publish, without commentary, the full ledger and the guarantee trail to every creditor who asked, which is not a threat when it is merely the truth walking out into daylight. The house seemed to tilt an inch, the way old structures do when one beam finally shifts after years of bearing more weight than it was promised, and just as my father inhaled to deliver whatever monologue would either save or sink him, my phone buzzed again with a new email, this one from the bank's fraud unit, carrying an attachment I opened with hands that shook from the quiet adrenaline of a person who has driven through a blizzard and found the road still under her tires, and the screen filled with a scanned authorization page bearing a witness signature in precise, schoolteacher cursive that I knew without question because I learned to form my letters by copying it on birthday cards, and in that split second before anyone else saw the name, I heard myself ask the room, more to the air than to the people in it, whether betrayal feels different when the handwriting is your mother's. For a long second after the screen flashed my mother's name under the neat witness signature, I could hear only the soft, traitorous sounds of a house continuing with its chores, the refrigerator humming, the clock chewing minutes, the dishwasher burping once as if to clear its throat, and in that ordinary domestic chorus I understood that betrayal does not always arrive cloaked in malice or greed. Sometimes it wears a cardigan and brings a casserole. And it tells itself a story about helping a son reach his potential while asking a daughter to be as flexible as good rubber, which snaps back until the day it cracks. My mother's hand trembled and then steadied on the back of the chair the way it always has before she says something brave in a small voice, and she explained, not quite meeting my eyes, that Michael had been desperate and that Dad had promised to cover any risk and that she had only witnessed what she was told was routine, a clerk's formality, nothing binding or dangerous. Nothing that would place teeth at my throat, and she said the sentence that floats like incense in houses like ours: families do what they must, without quite noticing that the smoke stings. My father began to speak in the defensive rhythms of a man who believes history can still be persuaded to change its mind, and Michael paced with a restless energy that looked like ambition if you did not know the ledger under it. But I had no space left for narratives that excused the damage they inflicted, so I picked up the folder and placed it in front of my mother, and I told her evenly that I loved her and that I was done paying tuition for a school that keeps failing me. The negotiation that followed was not television pretty, no raised voices or slammed doors, just the clink and scrape of boundaries being moved inch by inch across old habits. And I laid out terms with the politeness of a person who has learned that clear is kind even when it feels like steel. My mother would sign an affidavit by morning acknowledging that she witnessed a signature that was not mine because she was told I had approved it. My father would post a written correction to the alumni page retracting the favorite child storyline and naming the quiet backers without adjectives or spin. Michael would send a signed letter to his creditors by noon on Monday acknowledging the disputed guarantees and proposing a repayment plan drafted by a neutral attorney and the house fund. The one they had dressed up as community stewardship while using it as a family tide would return my surplus in monthly transfers labeled, with cheerful precision, Backstage Crew Trust Refund, because if we are going to be honest, then even the bank memos should know what they are. In exchange, I would file a hold rather than an immediate criminal complaint. I would accept a mediated settlement instead of spectacle, and I would keep the family thread from blooming into a neighborhood headline if any term slipped. The scheduled package of documents, ledger, messages, guarantee images would go to the bank's fraud unit, the credit bureaus, and the alumni board without additional commentary, a release set by a timer I had already prepared. Because sometimes the only way to take a breath is to know the air will not disappear the second you exhale. Eric stood behind me like a pillar you do not notice until the storm shoves the roof, and his quiet nod told me our line was straight even if the path wobbled. So I turned to my mother, who took the pen with the care of someone handling a small blade, and watched her sign the affidavit with a face that looked older than it had an hour ago, then watched my father type and retype the correction with a stubborn dignity that insisted on full sentences and proper commas, as if grammar might redeem content, and finally watched Michael draft the letter to his creditors with a painful attempt at humility that stumbled over every other phrase, yet reached the end without hiding behind the family again. I sent the documents to the neutral attorney we had asked to stay on call. I toggled the timer from immediate to conditional, and, because revenge is best when it also repairs the thing it cuts, I made one more move that tasted like iron and relief at once. I set up an automatic donation, a small percentage from my returned surplus, to a local scholarship fund for women retooling careers after family detours, tucked under a name so modest it would never invite conversation, because my victory should purchase more than silence. Morning arrived like a stiff truth, the kind that hurts and helps in equal measure, and the house woke to phone buzzes and polite inquiries and a single, clipped response from a creditor that made Michael swallow hard, but did not crush him. Which is a reasonable result for a man learning the difference between help and extraction. My father's post went live and collected sober, relieved comments from people who like clean stories even when they contain mess. My mother brewed coffee in the quiet kitchen and placed a mug in front of me without apology, because she knows I prefer deeds to speeches, and in the calm that followed I realized that my revenge had not been the explosion I once fantasized about delivering. It had been a series of switches flipped in rooms no one visits until the lights go out, and now the house glowed in a way that made it impossible to pretend where the wiring ran. By afternoon, the relatives had drifted back to their lives like birds settling after a storm. Eric and I drove home past the grocery store where I have hidden in the freezer aisle during worse holidays, and in our living room I opened the email with the timer rule and stared at the small countdown clock that would dispatch everything on Monday morning if I did nothing, a little machine that cared nothing for family meetings or second thoughts. The text from my father arrived just as the sun slid down the neighbor's roofline, not an apology and not a command, a single sentence that read, "We did what you asked, and I hope that means you will choose the family." Which would have sounded generous if I were not still holding the affidavit with my mother's careful signature and the memory of my name on a dotted line I never touched. I told Eric I needed air. I walked to the porch where the evenings smelled like cut grass and distant charcoal, and I let the thought land that has been circling me for years, that I am not the family's personal ATM with better manners. I am a person with a life that deserves its own headline, and I opened the email rule and hovered over the toggle like a pilot deciding whether to land or circle. Somewhere, the dishwasher exhaled, a neighbor's dog barked once, and my phone vibrated with 2 new messages. One was a screenshot from the scholarship fund showing the first tiny automatic donation clearing, and the other was a photo from my mother of the dining table set for Sunday dinner, with one place intentionally left empty, no caption, just the chair pulled out a few inches like an invitation or a warning. I watched the timer tick down another minute, felt the old reflex to save everyone wrestle the new insistence to save myself, and I left the toggle where it was, not as a threat but as a promise to the person who finally put her own name back in her own hands. Then I stepped inside to the sound of Eric washing dishes with the water turned up too high, and I said, in a voice that surprised me with its steadiness, that we had 48 hours to decide what family means and who gets to define the word, which is to say the story did not end, it simply started telling the truth out loud.